The galaxy had forgotten the sound of human war. It had been so long that their enemies no longer feared the Terrans. Their allies no longer remembered their power, and the younger races whispered that maybe the old stories were lies. For 4,000 years, Earth had stayed quiet, hidden behind its defenses, refusing to rise, refusing to fight. Refusing to speak, they built no grand fleets. They joined no wars, they ignored every border conflict. They were ghosts watching from the edges of the stars. No one could remember the last time humanity had drawn a blade. The silence had made the galaxy arrogant. It made them believe humanity had grown soft. But they were wrong, they were always wrong. Because silence was not weakness, it was warning. It began on a night above Europa Station, a quiet human colony on the edge of the galactic spiral, far from any war, where people lived simple lives under silver skies and cold stars. Children played in fields of frozen grass, their laughter echoing through domes built beneath the shimmering auroras. They never imagined the Empire would come here. It was a place without soldiers, without walls, because for generations humanity believed no one would dare, but they did, and that was their first mistake. The Empire came in black ships with silver markings, silent and arrogant. They moved through the colony like hunters stalking a sleeping animal. They didn't burn the buildings. They didn't destroy the station. They took only the children, hundreds of them, from schools, from homes, from their beds. The night was filled with quiet crying, then silence. As the ships disappeared into the stars, the adults screamed into the void, calling for Earth, calling for the fleet that never came, but no message returned. The Empire broadcasted their victory across the galaxy, showing the children lined up in chains, their cold message cutting through every frequency. The old wolves are toothless, they said, and across the stars, other empires laughed, but beneath the surface of Earth, under mountains older than history, deep inside the stone, something old opened its eyes. There was no alarm, no blaring sirens, just the slow, steady hum of ancient systems that had been silent for centuries. In a dark chamber where dust had not been disturbed in millennia, rows of massive black screens flickered to life. Showing the coordinates of Europa Station, red lines drew paths across star maps. Ancient fleets hidden in the void began to stir. No command was given, no council gathered. Humanity had built something that did not wait for orders, something that was never meant to be used lightly. But they had taken the children, and that was enough in the heart of the Terran war bunker, buried under Antarctica's frozen crust. An old man stood alone, his face carved by time, his eyes tired yet cold as iron. He had been waiting his entire life for this. The day the silence would end, he touched the control panel, and old war satellites whispered to each other for the first time in thousands of years. Hidden shipyards beneath black oceans came alive, their walls shaking as titanic ships began to power up. The stars outside Earth did not change, but the air around the world shifted. The kind of shift that makes predators freeze without knowing why across the galaxy. Military sensors began to pick up faint static. Nothing solid, nothing measurable, just a soft hum. Most dismissed it as background noise. But on an old Imperial warship stationed near the edge of human space, the captain stared at the reading with a sinking feeling in his chest. He didn't know why, but it felt like something was staring back at them through the void. Something older than the Empire. Something dangerous, he tried to warn his superiors. But his messages were ignored. The Empire was drunk on its victory. They believed humans would cry. They believed humanity would beg. They did not understand what they had awakened back on Europa Station. The ground where the children were taken was still stained with their footprints. The parents stood in the cold wind, faces frozen in silent rage, not screaming anymore. Because humans did not scream when their hearts turned to steel. They grew quiet, colder, harder, and that silence reached across the stars, into the black heart of Earth, into the Terran command network, where it was received not as a plea but as permission. Humanity had never needed orders to defend its children. For 4,000 years, the galaxy told stories about the old Terran fleet, ships that could swallow light, soldiers who moved without a sound, commanders who never asked for surrender. But most thought those were only myths. Bedtime horrors used to scare young alien children. But myths are dangerous when they're true, and in the deep space between the stars, the myths began to move. black shapes rising slowly from hidden hangars buried in dead asteroids, in forgotten moons, in shadows where no one dared look. They had waited for this moment longer than most empires had existed. The empire celebrated. They hosted banquets. Their nobles drank in silver halls. They paraded the captured children across their capital to show the galaxy that humanity was broken. But in that same moment, far away, a single Terran beacon flared red for the first time in 4,000 years. The signal was silent but absolute. It was not a call for help. It was the signal of war. Humanity did not announce it with speeches. Humanity did not threaten with words. They simply opened the doors of the storm they had been hiding all this time. On the council worlds, whispers began to spread like wind through empty streets. Earth has moved, they said, and suddenly the old stories no longer felt like fiction. A single Imperial patrol ship stationed on the rim of Terran space sent one last transmission before it vanished. The captain's voice cracked with fear as he whispered, "They're awake," and then static filled the channel. Their ship was never seen again, and across the galaxy, fear began to creep into the hearts of those who had once mocked humanity. The galaxy had forgotten the sound of human war, but war remembered, the weapons remembered, the void remembered, and now it was awake. As the Empire's fleets basked in their arrogance, they didn't notice the stars dimming above them. They didn't notice the growing quiet, the kind of quiet that comes before the storm. Humanity had stayed silent for 4,000 years, not because they were weak, but because they were giving the galaxy time to forget what they were capable of. And now they were about to remind them on a hidden Terran command ship, buried deep in the shadows of Saturn's rings. Commander Rourke stared at the incoming reports without blinking, his crew silent, their faces hard. They were the descendants of soldiers who had sworn never to raise their weapons again, unless the unthinkable happened. And now they had taken the children. Rourke's voice cut through the cold air like steel. "Activate everything," he said. No one asked questions, no one hesitated. They all knew what this meant across the void. Massive fleets hidden for centuries began to unfold like wings of a creature that was never supposed to wake. The stars around Earth flickered as dark ships moved like shadows through the black. The galaxy still thought Earth was quiet, still thought they were weak, but the silence that came now was different. Heavier, older, it was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of something preparing to end everything that touched what it loved. The Empire had taken human children, and in doing so, they had shattered not just a treaty, not just a rule, but the long, terrifying silence of Earth. In the heart of the Imperial capital, where towers of cold steel touched the clouds and banners of conquest waved under a blood-red sky, the High Council of the Empire gathered inside the Grand Hall, its walls carved with the history of 1,000 victories, its floor polished with the arrogance of countless empires they had crushed. Alien nobles sat on long crystal thrones, their faces twisted into cruel smiles, the air thick with the stench of power. In the center of the hall hung a massive hologram of the captured human children, their small faces filled with confusion and fear, chained like trophies beneath the Empire's flag. And when the image filled the room, the nobles laughed, not a soft laugh, but the sharp, ugly sound of creatures who believed they owned the galaxy. They clapped their jeweled hands and raised glasses of glowing liquid to toast the end of the Terran myth. Because in their minds, humanity was nothing more than a shadow of the past, a legend used to scare children, not a threat to their Rule One commander. Tall and lean with silver scales, stood at the edge of the room, his eyes not laughing, his jaw tight, his claws tapping nervously against his belt as the crowd celebrated. He had studied the old records. He knew the stories that others called lies, stories of human fleets moving like ghosts, of planets burning in silence, of entire armadas vanishing without a scream. And he knew one thing the others had forgotten. Terrans did not warn twice. He spoke up, his voice cold but clear. This was a mistake. The laughter around him dimmed just enough for a few to glance at him. But the council speaker, a creature with skin like black stone and eyes like burning stars, leaned back on his throne and sneered, "A mistake? We took their children and they did nothing. Look at their silence. The wolves are old. Their teeth are gone." And the room erupted in laughter again, drowning out the warning like it was nothing but wind outside the Grand Hall. Celebrations filled the streets. The Empire had broadcast the capture to every corner of the galaxy, showing the Terrans kneeling, or so they believed. Marketplaces were lit with bright banners. Soldiers paraded through avenues. Children of alien nobles cheered. Even if no one else did, something ancient had shifted. The silence of the humans was not weakness, it was weight. It was waiting. He turned to his second officer and whispered, "They're not quiet because they're broken. They're quiet because they're preparing." But his second officer only shook his head nervously. No one believed in Terran power anymore. No one except those who studied the past. And even they tried to forget, but he knew what was coming. He could feel it in the bones of the universe. The Speaker of the Council rose to his feet, spreading his arms wide to the assembly, his voice booming like thunder. For 4,000 years they hid in the shadows, too afraid to fight, too weak to stand. And now their children belong to us. The age of the Terrans is over. The nobles roared in approval. They believed they had broken something sacred, that they had stripped humanity of its last shred of pride, but arrogance is always loudest before it dies. And though no one in the chamber knew it, the flicker in the sky above them was the first sign of the storm to come, high above the capital. Beyond their atmosphere, Imperial satellites glitched for just a fraction of a second. Radar screens blinked with static and then returned to normal. The technicians dismissed it as nothing. They did not know that something had passed through their defenses. Not a fleet, not an army, just a single signal, silent and invisible, a whisper from the stars that only one species could make. The signal that meant Earth had heard, the signal that meant the silence was breaking. But the Empire kept celebrating, drunk on its own pride, too blind to see the shadow rising in the void. As night fell on the capital, the image of the captured human children was projected onto every surface of the city, a display of dominance meant to humiliate an ancient power. But among the crowd in the quiet corners of the watching galaxy, whispers began to spread. Old soldiers from forgotten wars stiffened. Traders who once crossed Terran borders grew uneasy. And somewhere on a distant station, an old admiral from another empire muttered to himself, "Fools. They don't know what they've done." But his words were lost to the wind. No one wanted to believe that humanity, the silent, patient humanity, would ever rise again, and yet, far away on the edges of space, old sensors blinked awake one by one. Black systems buried under forgotten moons began to hum softly. And deep under Earth's crust, old codes long sealed behind stone and silence stirred. Humanity was not sending a message. Humanity was answering one. And before the Empire realized it, the first tremor of their end had already begun. Out beyond the borders of the Empire, where the stars grew darker and the void swallowed the light like a living thing, something began to move. It was not loud, it was not fast. It was slow, patient, deliberate, the kind of movement that made sensors flicker for a heartbeat before returning to normal as if nothing was there. The Imperial patrol fleet stationed along the outer sectors received faint readings, strange signals hidden beneath the static. At first, the commanders thought it was just interference, a glitch in their systems. But the readings kept coming back, repeating, growing stronger with every passing hour. Black shapes too large to be asteroids drifted just beyond their scanning range, cold and silent. And the more they tried to focus, the less they could see. It was like the void itself was hiding the truth. On the bridge of patrol ship K-17, Captain Drevel leaned forward, his scaled hands tightening on the edge of the console, his eyes narrowing at the strange ripples crawling across the radar. "What is that?" he muttered. The officer beside him stammered something about signal distortion. But Drevel knew better. He had fought wars before. He had seen fleets move like wolves through smoke. And this didn't feel like distortion. It felt like something was watching them from the dark. Their ship sent out a small probe, but it vanished. Not destroyed, not jammed, just gone. Like it had been swallowed by something too big to understand. The crew exchanged uneasy looks, the kind of look soldiers wear when their instincts start to whisper the truth. Their commanders don't want to hear. Across the border sectors, one patrol after another reported the same flickering shadows, the same vanishing drones, the same soft pulsing in the dark that felt more like breathing than movement. The Imperial command dismissed it all as sensor malfunctions. They said it was human bluffing, propaganda. The idea of humans striking fear without firing a shot made them laugh. But deep inside, the soldiers who manned those lonely outposts began to sweat, because they could feel the difference. The stars felt different, colder, heavier. The kind of weight that only comes before something terrible. In a hidden relay station, an old Imperial technician who had fought during the border wars 3 centuries ago stared at the screens and whispered to himself, "This is how they used to move." The younger officers around him looked confused. "Who?" they asked, and his voice came out like cracked stone. "The Terrans?" The room grew quiet for a moment. No one laughed, not because they believed him, but because deep down, their instincts told them he wasn't lying. The first disappearance came quietly. A small patrol cruiser en route near the Helix Rift. It sent one last transmission, a single line. "They're here." Then nothing, not even static. The Empire launched search teams, but they found only empty space. Not a single piece of metal, not a floating body, not even the faintest trace of a battle. It was as if the ship had been erased. The second disappearance came hours later, then the third, then the 10th. And suddenly those faint readings the Empire laughed at began to spread across their maps like a slow-moving storm. On the main Imperial command deck, alarms started to flicker one after another. Reports flooding in from sectors that had been quiet for centuries. The generals argued, the nobles shouted, but no one had answers. The Minister of Defense tried to dismiss it again. Until an entire fleet, 4,000 soldiers, 8 ships, vanished mid-transmission. The last thing they saw was a faint shimmer in the stars, like something enormous passing through them without making a sound. That was the moment the laughter stopped. That was the moment even the arrogant ones felt the cold crawl up their spines. Meanwhile, in the Terran deep void, the old fleet moved like it had never slept. Massive black warships gliding through the shadows, their surfaces swallowing light, their drives leaving no trace. The Terrans didn't need to be seen. They needed to be felt. The galaxy had forgotten how humanity fought, but the darkness remembered. Their ships carried no emblems, no colors, no warnings. Just silence, perfect silence, and wherever that silence went. Fear followed aboard patrol ship K-12. The crew gathered at the viewing deck, their hearts pounding as they watched the stars bend ever so slightly, like something enormous was shifting behind them. The comms filled with broken whispers. "It's nothing," one officer tried to say. But the lie fell flat, the captain whispered. "It's them." And everyone in the room went still, because the humans were no longer a story, no longer a myth. They were moving through the dark again, and the Empire had no idea how to stop them back in the capital. As these reports poured in, the Council tried to maintain their arrogance. But even they could feel it in the air. The shadows were moving. The old silence that had made them feel safe was gone, replaced by something sharper, colder, heavier. The sound of war approaching without a sound. The galaxy had forgotten the wolves, but the wolves had not forgotten them. An Imperial prison ship drifted through the darkness like a silver dagger, its engines glowing faintly as it carried the captured human children toward the heart of the Empire. Its halls were quiet, except for the sound of mechanical footsteps and the soft, frightened breaths of the children locked inside their containment cells. They were small, innocent, unaware of the storm they had set loose simply by being taken. The guards walked through the corridors with arrogance painted across their faces. They believed the Terrans would stay silent. They believed no one would come. But outside that ship, in the black sea of the void, something was already moving. The sensors on the prison ship flickered once, twice, then flatlined for a heartbeat before returning to normal. The officer on watch dismissed it as a glitch, but deep down, something in his stomach twisted because the stars outside the window had shifted ever so slightly, like the darkness itself had taken a breath. The captain of the ship was leaning back in his chair, half bored, half smug, reading the Empire's public broadcast showing the captured human children paraded like trophies. The image made him grin. He thought this was history. The night the old wolves died. The night the galaxy finally stopped whispering their name with fear. But then the lights on the bridge dimmed, not a flicker this time, but a deep, slow fade, as if something was swallowing the power itself. The comm officer shouted that the sensors had gone blind. The starfield outside disappeared into a black wall, and every sound on the ship seemed to shrink into a single sharp silence. The captain stood, barking orders, demanding scans, but nothing worked. The long-range systems returned only static. Their short-range readings showed nothing, not even their own reflection, as if the ship was floating inside a void with no walls. Then came the first noise. Not a boom, not an explosion, just a faint scrape. Like something dragging a blade across the outer hull. The crew froze. Every muscle locking in place, the sound came again. Slower, heavier, closer. Someone whispered, "Is it debris?" But they knew it wasn't. Debris doesn't move like it's hunting on Deck 12. A guard patrolling the cell blocks noticed the lights above his head dim one by one. Like footsteps approaching, the air grew thick and cold. His breath came out in visible fog. Then the emergency door at the end of the corridor opened without a sound, even though it was locked. Pitch-black shadows spilled into the hallway, not like smoke, but like liquid night crawling across the floor. The guard screamed into his comm, but the channel was dead. His voice died in his throat when a tall figure emerged from the darkness, armored in black, face hidden beneath a visor that reflected nothing. It moved without a sound, and behind it more figures stepped through the dark like they had always belonged to it. Terran strike operatives up on the bridge. Alarms exploded all at once. Decks 12, 9, and 4 were breached. Security teams vanished without reporting. The captain's hands shook as he yelled for reinforcements. But the reinforcements were already gone. Cameras showed only the same thing over and over again. Black armored figures moving like shadows through smoke. Each step quiet. Each motion controlled. They didn't shout, they didn't talk. They simply advanced. And every time they reached a new section, the lights went out and the Empire lost another piece of their ship in the cell bay. One of the human children, a small boy with dark hair, lifted his head when he heard the sound of metal groaning. He wasn't crying anymore. Something in the air had changed. The walls shook softly as the Terran soldiers reached the core of the prison ship. They moved like water, leaving no trace except silence and fear. One guard tried to fire his weapon, but before he could pull the trigger, his gun was ripped from his hands by an unseen force, and in the next heartbeat, he was gone. The boy pressed his hand against the cell door, and when the lights went out completely, he heard it. A soft voice through the dark, calm and familiar. "We're here." Minutes later, the bridge of the Imperial prison ship went black. The captain tried to scream orders, but a hand grabbed him from behind and dragged him into the darkness. No struggle, no sound, just gone. The crew followed one by one, until only the empty bridge remained, lit by the pale glow of failing consoles. Outside, the stars shifted again, this time revealing the shape that had been hiding there. A Terran warship, massive and black, its hull absorbing the light around it like a living shadow. It had never fired a single shot. It didn't need to. When the Empire's rescue teams arrived 3 hours later, they found the prison ship drifting, silent, powerless. Its hull sliced open with perfect precision, like something had entered and exited without disturbing a single piece of debris. The crew was gone. Not dead, gone. The children were missing too, and scrawled across the main hallway in sharp, clean Terran script were 4 words, glowing faintly against the metal. "You touched what's ours." The message spread across the galaxy like wildfire, burning away the arrogance that had filled Imperial halls. Their celebration turned to silence. Fear rippled through their fleets because this wasn't an attack of desperation. It was a warning. It was the first step of something far bigger, far older, and far more dangerous. The Terrans had not declared war with speeches or banners. They had simply appeared, taken back their own, and vanished into the night like a storm returning to the ocean. And in the quiet corners of the galaxy, the old soldiers who remembered whispered one truth. They're back. The galaxy had always measured power by the size of fleets, the weight of their guns, the number of soldiers standing in line. The Empire believed it was untouchable, because its fleet stretched across the stars like a golden wall, a sea of warships so large that entire worlds bowed at the sight of their banners. Their admirals stood tall. Their soldiers marched without fear. They believed that if humanity ever dared to resist, they would crush them in days. But when the Terran fleet finally moved, it didn't come like a storm they could see. It came like a shadow swallowing the light. It didn't roar, it didn't declare its arrival. It simply appeared quietly, everywhere all at once. Black ships slipping out of the void like knives sliding into the dark. The Empire's scanners didn't register their approach. Their patrols didn't sound alarms. Their satellites saw nothing. And then their fleets began to disappear on the edge of the Orion Belt. The Empire's third battle fleet held its position in a proud formation, 30 capital ships and thousands of support vessels. An unstoppable hammer meant to crush any rebellion. The soldiers on board were laughing, drinking, convinced the humans were too afraid to respond. Their captains bragged about who would take credit for the Terrans' surrender. But then the stars behind them vanished, not dimmed, vanished, like something had slid between them and the light itself. The radar officers on the bridge of the flagship stared at the empty black screens, their hands shaking as they whispered, "We're surrounded." But surrounded by what, they couldn't tell. Because the Terran fleet didn't look like anything they'd ever seen. It didn't glow, it didn't scream. It just waited in the dark. Then the first ship went silent. No explosion. No warning. One moment it was there. The next it was a black hole in their formation. Seconds later, another disappeared. Then another. Panic spread like cracks in glass. Captains shouted over comms, demanding answers. But all they heard was static. The admirals barked orders to fire at anything. But their targeting systems couldn't find a single lock. The Terran fleet moved inside their formation like a predator moving through water, striking silently, slicing ships apart from within, cutting power systems with surgical precision. Entire warships went cold before anyone could reach the escape pods, and the only thing left was silence. Inside the Empire's flagship, the admiral stood frozen, sweat running down the back of his neck as he watched icons on the tactical map vanish one by one. It was too fast, too quiet, too clean. This wasn't war. This was extermination. His crew begged for retreat orders, but retreat to where? The Terran ships were already behind them, above them, below them, moving like they had been there all along. One officer whispered with wide eyes, "They're everywhere." And the admiral finally understood the old stories weren't lies. They were warnings, warnings that no one had listened to across the galaxy. The same thing began to happen. Entire fleets meant to protect Imperial worlds vanished into silence. Their last transmissions were always the same. Broken whispers, flickering screens, and then nothing. The Terran fleet was not fighting like the Empire expected. They weren't charging into battle like fools. They were hunting, slow and precise, striking at the heart of the machine, cutting off power, severing comms, leaving the Empire blind and deaf before striking its throat. It was like watching a sleeping giant being dismantled piece by piece in the Imperial War Command Center. Alarms flashed across hundreds of screens. Reports poured in from every sector. Fleets gone dark, colonies losing contact, outer defenses collapsing. Admirals screamed at one another, demanding to know how a silent fleet could crush them so fast. Some even refused to believe it was humanity, saying no race could move that cleanly, that perfectly. But the old general, the one who had warned them on the day they took the children, sat quietly in his chair, his voice calm and hollow. "This is exactly what they do." And the room fell silent on the field of battle. The Terran ships glided through wreckage like predators through smoke, their black hulls reflecting nothing, their movements silent, elegant, terrifying. They fired only when they needed to. Short bursts of invisible energy that shredded Imperial armor like paper. The soldiers on the Empire's ships never saw their enemy. They only heard the quiet as their systems shut down one by one, leaving them floating helpless in the void. Surrounded by shadows they couldn't fight. Commander Rourke stood on the bridge of the Terran flagship, the war map glowing faintly around him, his expression cold and controlled. His officers worked in silence, no shouting, no panic. This wasn't vengeance driven by rage. This was an execution delivered by precision. He gave no speech, no dramatic command, just a simple line. "Proceed," and the Terran fleet moved as one. A single shadow swallowing the last of the Empire's pride. When the attack ended, there were no victory cheers, no celebrations. Because Terrans didn't fight for glory, they fought to end things. The third battle fleet of the Empire, the largest in known space, was gone in less than an hour. Not burned, not scattered, erased. Their wreckage drifting in the void, cold and quiet. The surviving Imperial captains whispered to their dying comm channels, begging for help. But none came because the same thing was happening everywhere. The Empire had always believed power was measured in noise, but the Terrans had reminded them of a different truth. The most terrifying enemy is the one that does not shout, the one that does not warn, the one that strikes from the dark without blinking. And as the last Imperial distress beacon faded into silence, the galaxy finally understood that humanity's silence had never been peace. It had been a warning. Entire empires that once roared like gods now whispered in fear, as the Terran fleet spread across the stars like a shadow swallowing entire worlds. The empire that had paraded human children as trophies was breaking apart faster than anyone could understand. Their grand fleets, once the symbol of control, lay silent in the void. Their glowing capitals were flickering like dying embers, and their command centers echoed with panic instead of arrogance. They had believed their size, their power, their weapons made them invincible. They had thought humans were quiet because they were weak, but the truth hit them like a blade pressed against their throat. Humanity had not been silent out of fear. They had been silent because no one had given them a reason to wake. And now that they had, the galaxy was seeing what they had tried to forget across the Imperial core. Massive cities built on pillars of power began to fall, not to bombs or loud wars, but to perfect surgical silence. Black ships appeared above their skies like ghosts, slipping through their planetary shields as if those shields were made of mist. And once they were in position, every light on the ground died. Every defense cannon fell quiet, and the screams never had a chance to reach the sky. Entire cities were left frozen in stillness, not destroyed, but owned. The Terrans didn't need to set everything on fire. They simply took it. Their power was quiet and absolute. Their war was not a storm. It was the night itself, inside the Imperial High Command Chamber. The same nobles who had laughed when the children were taken now sat with trembling hands. Their polished armor didn't shine anymore. Their perfect speeches had turned into desperate whispers. Hollow screens around them flashed red as system after system went dark. Fleets lost contact. Planetary defenses stopped responding. And for the first time in thousands of years, the Empire didn't have a plan. The Minister of War slammed his hands on the table, screaming for reports, screaming for someone to explain how humanity was winning without even announcing a war. But no one could give an answer. One officer stammered, "We can't find them. We can't track them. We can't stop them." And those words spread through the chamber like poison. In the lower levels of the Imperial capital, civilians gathered in the streets, staring up at the sky, and they saw it too. A black shape moving above their city. Slow and enormous, it made no sound. It cast no light. It was simply there. A Terran warship the size of a small continent, hovering without a single engine flare. Their planetary shields didn't even register it as a threat, because the Terrans were already inside their defenses. People ran, screamed, fell to their knees. They knew something had changed forever. Their empire was not being invaded. It was being erased aboard the Terran flagship. Commander Rourke watched the map with cold precision. Entire sectors blinking off the Imperial grid with each passing hour. His crew operated in silence. Their movements sharp, efficient, terrifying in their calm. They were not fighting a war they might lose. They were delivering a punishment that had already been decided. Humanity had waited for 4,000 years. They had buried their weapons, locked away their fleet, promised never to fight again. But the Empire had taken their children, and there were no negotiations for that. No mercy, no treaties, no warning. This was not a war. This was a reckoning. The Empire sent out desperate fleets from their core worlds, but they never returned. Black ships moved like a current through their ranks, cutting them apart without being seen. No bright explosions, no drawn-out battles, just silence, and then nothing. Admirals who once boasted about burning other species alive now hid in bunkers, whispering in the dark like frightened children. The same nobles who raised glasses to their victory over humanity now sat pale-faced as their empire bled out into the void, piece by piece, without the Terrans ever needing to shout. The old general who had warned them all sat in the corner of the council chamber, his voice hollow as the others screamed and argued. He didn't shout anymore because he understood what was happening. He had studied the old wars. He knew humanity's silence was never weakness. It was the sound of a predator choosing when to strike. He whispered to the speaker of the council, "They won't stop," but the speaker didn't answer, because he already knew it too. This was not about conquering territory. This was about making the galaxy remember why no one touched humanity's children. Above the capital, the sky finally went black. Every power grid shut down. Every satellite went blind. The Council's comm lines fell silent one by one, and the people who once ruled with iron fists looked up at the massive Terran warships descending slowly. Silently, not to negotiate, not to posture, but to end the age of the Empire in that moment. All the laughter from the night they celebrated their crime echoed back in their minds, like ghosts dragging chains through an empty hall, and far from the Empire's burning core. The rest of the galaxy watched with breathless horror. They remembered the old stories now, the stories their ancestors used to whisper in the dark, stories that began the same way this war had begun, with silence. Humanity had not returned to the stars as soldiers or diplomats. They had returned as the storm that doesn't scream. And one by one, every world understood the same truth. When you hurt what humanity protects, you don't get a war. You get extinction delivered in silence. The Grand Imperial Council chamber that once echoed with arrogance. Laughter and war speeches now sat in a silence so thick it felt alive. The walls that had witnessed centuries of cruelty and conquest seemed to shiver beneath the weight of what stood above them. The great windows that overlooked the capital showed nothing but black sky. No stars, no moons, just the shadow of Terran warships blocking out the heavens. The nobles and ministers who once mocked humanity now huddled together like cornered animals, their fine robes torn, their hands shaking, their voices broken. Messages from across the galaxy blinked red on the holoscreens. Every system reporting the same thing. Terran fleets above their skies. Defenses offline, fleets erased, cities under silent occupation. The Empire's heart wasn't beating anymore. It was being held in someone else's hand. The Speaker of the Council stood slowly, his voice cracking as he looked around at what remained of his empire. His ministers stared back at him with empty eyes. "Send them a message," he said. "We surrender." And those words, once unthinkable to say inside this chamber, fell like stones into the cold air. The communication officers scrambled to open a channel, their hands shaking so badly they could barely activate the controls. But the moment the signal went out into the void, it returned instantly, not with static, not with a long speech, but with a single image on the screen. The Terran insignia glowing against a field of black. Then came the voice, not loud, not angry, but calm, steady, cold. Surrender was never an option. The room froze, the speaker's knees weakened. The officers went pale, and then the voice continued. "You took what was ours. You woke what you should have feared, and now you will remember." The transmission cut, leaving the chamber in a silence so sharp it made their hearts pound. Outside, the Terran fleet began to descend through the black clouds above the capital, slow and precise, like a tide that had finally reached the shore. No blaring horns, no roars of war, just the weight of inevitability. Panic broke out in the streets of the capital as civilians fell to their knees, some praying, some begging, some too afraid to speak. No one fired a shot. No one even thought of fighting back, because what they saw was not an army. It was a force too vast, too quiet, too controlled to fight. The Terran warships moved as if they were part of the night itself, black steel gliding over broken towers, casting shadows that swallowed entire districts, and then, for the first time since the beginning of the war, the humans revealed themselves, not as diplomats, not as prisoners, but as executioners who didn't need to raise their voice to be heard in the council chamber. The speaker fell to his knees, whispering for mercy, his hands pressed against the floor that once belonged to conquerors. "Please, we surrender, spare us." His voice cracked like glass. But the Terrans had already answered. They had answered the day the children were taken. They had answered when the Empire laughed. They didn't need to repeat themselves now, far above. Commander Rourke stood on the bridge of the Terran flagship, his face expressionless, eyes cold, watching the once mighty Empire crumble beneath the silence they had ignored. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply gave a single nod, and the fleet began its final move, all across the Imperial core. Lights went out for the last time. Defense systems turned to dust. The last remaining fleet burned silently in orbit without ever firing a shot. Entire worlds that once screamed the Empire's name in pride now whispered the same word in terror. Terrans, the name itself had become a shadow, a reminder of the mistake that ended everything. As the capital fell, the rest of the galaxy watched in breathless fear because they were quiet for so long, and the old general sitting in the shadows, the only one who had warned them, answered in a voice barely above a breath. That's exactly why. His eyes lifted to the massive Terran dreadnought filling the sky, its surface absorbing the light of their dying empire, and for a brief second he thought he could hear it. Not a roar, not a shout, but a heartbeat, steady, unstoppable. Human? The speaker tried one last time. He sent a desperate transmission into the void, his voice breaking into tears. Why are you doing this? And the answer came back soft, calm, and final. Because you didn't listen. Then the transmission ended. The last of the Imperial command lines went dark, and above their dead capital, the Terran fleet stood still like a black crown resting on the ashes of a fallen throne. The galaxy would not forget this night. The night when the silence spoke louder than any army ever could. The night when humanity reminded the stars why they should have never been provoked. The Empire was gone, and all that remained was the cold, endless silence of the Terrans watching from above.